When I was searching for my first ordained position, I was living in South Carolina at the time and was enjoying the sunshine of the Palmetto State, where 85% of the population claimed to be Christians. I consider myself a Southern girl at heart. I had been slowly working my way south, growing up mostly in Indiana, and then moving to Kentucky for seminary, and then I moved to South Carolina for a chaplain residency. I was certain that God would never make me leave the South in order to return to the Midwest, where cold and snow existed. When I first moved to South Carolina, I was taking a big risk because I moved to the state by myself, not knowing anyone prior to going there. I found a place to live, started a new job, found a church, and began developing my own peer group. This was a very difficult storm in my life, and I couldn't believe God would allow me to go through a situation that difficult again, having to essentially start my life over. I limited my job search to a position only in the southern states, primarily North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, and Alabama. Almost a full year had gone by, and I still hadn't found a position. Then one day I got a call from some place called Nationwide Children's Hospital in Columbus, Ohio. I didn't even remember applying for the job. When I came for an interview, I thought the place was nice enough, but it was in the Midwest, and you may remember I wasn't a big fan of at the time. And I didn't really want to go through that difficult experience again of having moved to a state that I was unfamiliar with. Around this same time, I happened to get online and see a quote that said, 24 astronauts were born in Ohio. What is it about your state that makes people want to flee the earth? And I thought to myself, well, that can't be good. Faith often requires taking risks. I think many of us try to avoid people and situations that require us to take risks. We try to stay away from being in a place where courage is needed. While at the same time, I feel many of us would say that we would like to live high-impact lives. We want to be difference makers. Making a difference means having the courage to take risks. This is seen throughout the scriptures, where those used by God to make a significant difference in any way are called upon to take a risk. In our Old Testament lesson this morning, Elijah ran away in fear that the Israelites had threatened to kill him. But God challenged him, saying, "Go back the way you came," and challenged him to undertake a new mission. God promised that no matter how severe the problem, God would be present and protect Elijah. Our gospel lesson this morning has two levels to the story. The first level is in which we see Jesus as the one who calms the storm, as the one who brings peace to those who sail through life. The second level, and our primary focus for this morning, is the one in which we see Jesus as the one who bestows power, as the one who calls to his followers, to those who are willing to step out of the safety of the boat. Jesus is the giver of power to those who are willing to take a chance, to take a risk. Our passage this morning comes immediately after the feeding of the 5,000 miracle that Bill preached on last Sunday. After this miraculous event, Jesus immediately commanded the disciples to get in the boat and go ahead of him to the other side of the sea, while he dismissed the crowd that had gathered. The actual translation says that Jesus made, or he forced the disciples to get into the boat, as if to say that they were reluctant and didn't want to go. Maybe they sensed there was a risk here, but Jesus made them get into the boat. He was not calling them away from the storm. He was calling them into it. Afterwards, Jesus went up on a mountainside by himself to pray. This was not insignificant because this was a regular discipline of Jesus. By evening, Jesus was alone, and the disciples were far from shore, being battered by the wind and the waves. They struggle all night against the storm that is crashing against them. And then in the fourth watch of the night, which would be sometime between 3 and 6 a.m., they see someone or something walking across the water towards them. They were terrified, and quite naturally, given the circumstances, wouldn't you be as well if you saw a ghost-like figure walking across the water towards your boat in the middle of the night? They cried out in fear. In the midst of their crisis, when their energy reserves were spent, that is when Jesus reveals himself to them. Immediately, Jesus responded to the disciples' fear with the words, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." Jesus saying, "It is I," which also could be translated as "I am," is frequently where God's self-revelation occurs throughout Scripture. Peter answers Jesus first, saying, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." And Jesus answers by saying, "Come." So Peter climbs over the edge of the boat, puts his feet in the water, and begins to walk toward Jesus. Peter did not need to get out of the boat. He did not need to venture forth upon the stormy waters. He could have simply stayed where he was and waited for the Lord to come to him. He could have sheltered himself in the safety of the boat, in the knowledge that everything would be okay now that the Lord was coming to him and the other disciples. They were confident that Jesus' presence meant that they no longer needed to be afraid, even in spite of their circumstances. But Peter did not stay in the boat. Instead, he took a chance. He asked the Lord to tell him to come. He asked the Lord for the power to meet him in the middle of the sea. The passage does not say that Jesus calmed the seas to make Peter's steps easier. A chaplain at Duke University comments on this passage by saying, "Don't you find it strange that Peter was uncertain that the voice from the waves was the voice of Jesus unless that voice commanded him, 'Come on out, the water's fine.' And that's how you will know Jesus. Jesus is the one who extravagantly, recklessly commands you to leave the safety of the boat, to step into the sea, to test the waters and show what your faith is made of. That's Jesus. If he had not forced the disciples to embark on this uncertain journey, they would have missed the opportunity to see God's power revealed in their midst. Courage is not the absence of fear. Courage doesn't mean that you don't have any fear, but it means that fear is not the determining factor, that you have the faith to overcome it. I'm sure this was true for Peter as well. He was afraid, but he overcame his fear with faith. Peter had the courage to venture forth into danger and do what the Lord has said can be done, the courage to risk taking a step, simply because the Lord tells him it can be taken. Given the choice between continuing in a situation where, despite the burdens and the dangers that are all around, where there is a reasonable degree of safety, and venturing out into a new and unknown situation where the dangers seem even greater and where there is no apparent safety net, most people will elect to stay put, to stay where they are. That is why women will stay in a home where they and their children are being abused, rather than walk out and find a new life. That is why men will work for years in a job that is slowly destroying their health and happiness, rather than risk their homes and security by returning to school or starting their own businesses. That is why teenagers will not speak to someone whom they are attracted to because they are afraid of messing it up, afraid of being laughed at and rejected. What have we been afraid to do? What have we postponed because we dreaded the possible consequences? Who have we avoided because we did not know what to say to them? Where have we refused to go because we feared what might happen there? What goal have we hid from because we felt inadequate? What dream have we let wither and die? Sometimes we need to get out of the safety of the boat. We need to say to the Lord, Lord, if it is you, tell me to come. Now, I'm not recommending today that you take a wild chance on the first thing that comes along. I will not be responsible when your husband says to you that he gets that motorcycle he's always wanted because God is telling him to take a risk. But I am saying, if you have a dream, or if you are in a situation where wholeness and happiness are elusive, and you can sense is God calling you to take a chance, if you see that you can do something to help someone else, or simply feel that God is calling you to change something in your life that seems unchangeable, risk it. Peter, although he did not necessarily need to, he got out of the boat, and after being called by Jesus, he walked upon the sea. Peter was the disciple that decided quickly enough, this is an opportunity that I need to take. I think many of us would have just stayed in the boat and played the what if game. What if I step out of the boat and I just sink like a rock? What if? For me, the question was, what if I got to Ohio and I didn't meet any friends, didn't find a church I liked, which I can assure you has not happened, and that I hated it there? There is a tendency to just keep going over those scenarios and try to make a decision in such a way that there is no risk involved. Once you take all the risk out of a situation, there is no longer any call for faith. A famous theologian named Dietrich Bonhoeffer explains it this way. Peter had to leave the ship and risk his life on the sea in order to learn both his own weaknesses and the almighty power of the Lord. If Peter had not taken the risk, he never would have learned the meaning of faith. Peter did well. His faith held him up. The power of Christ held him up. And he continued to do well until he forgot about that power that he had called upon. He did well until he took his eyes off Jesus and started to pay attention to the wind and the waves, and he turned his focus towards the storm. When he allowed the storm and the winds to distract him, then Peter began to sink. When we take a risk and we venture out in obedience to the Lord to do something new, or simply fulfill what we believe our calling is, it is very important that we remember to stay focused on our goal and to trust that God will see us through despite what is happening around us. Peter begins to sink, but as he does, he remembers from where his help comes from, and he cries out, Lord, save me. And Jesus reaches out his hand and he catches him. As disciples, we will face our own storms and difficulties, but Jesus reassures us that when we step out, when we take a risk to come closer to God and then falter, the hand of Jesus reaches out to us and lifts us up. All we have to do is remember where our power comes from and to focus on him once again. Our call is to focus on Jesus instead of the storm. We do not need to doubt the outcome. We do not need to fear the adversity we encounter on the way. All we must do is keep focused on Jesus, to look where our help comes from. All we need to do is ask for the help we need and trust that it will come. Jesus is rarely early, but he is never late. Like Peter, who stepped out of the boat and walked on the water towards the Lord who had called him, we too can step out, and we really ought to step out, to respond to the Lord who calls to us. Making a difference means having the courage to take risks. South Carolina was familiar to me. It was comfortable. But at some point I realized that if I wanted to make a difference, if I wanted to get out of the mundane job that I was working at the time, I had to step out of the boat. I had to take a risk and move to a state that was out of my comfort zone. And as I have taken this risk and stepped out of the boat and moved to a new state, I have seen how God is blessing that, blessing my ministry at the hospital. And when I depend on God, I can see how God's working in my life here. Where is God asking you to get out of the boat this morning? Maybe it's in the work that you do. Maybe it's in your family or in your relationships. Maybe it's in your spiritual life with God. Or maybe it's somewhere else. But as you ponder this question, I invite you to remember, we can risk because we have a powerful Lord watching over us. We can trust because we have a forgiving God caring for us. And we can step out because we have a God who is sure to save. Amen.